What's going on with One Piece right now? I mean, Eustass kid? More like you just asked me. That man is awful. He is trash right now. I mean, look at his performance against Shanks. His rematch? Is he stupid? Is he a bum? Is he weak? Is he fraudulent? Well, let's talk about that right now. This is going to be a bit more of an unstructured video, just something light because I don't have the time to get into this as intricately as I normally would. It's not as tightly scripted, although I do still have a script, but most of it is documented safely in a Twitter conversation I had with a mutual of mine. So sit back on the couch, kick up your feet as you enjoy the first episode of Cup Rambling. You see, I have a soft spot for a specific kind of trope, a very common one, where characters are strong, but they're underutilizing their power or simply lack the creativity to make the most of it. I've been told before that it's bad writing to have such powerful abilities on characters and not write them knowing how to use them well, despite their power being unique solely to them. But let's be honest with ourselves here. If we were personally blessed with superhuman abilities, even remotely close to how they were in anime or manga or cartoons or comics, we wouldn't even be able to properly wrap our heads around them in the slightest for at least a handful of years. To cut my lengthy intro short and get right to the purpose of today's video is, in brief, about complex power systems and realistically portraying how characters might interpret them, and overlong about how Eustass Kid is stronger than a lot of the community believes he is. The One Piece power system used to be painfully simple. You had 3 different types of devil fruits, and then you had people who were just people. Granted, they were incredibly strong people, but they were just simple swordsmen, gunsmen, marksmen, actually, or, people who fought hand to hand. Back then, devil fruits had an inherent advantage over most people, but despite their godlike powers, they weren't automatically made better than others. They were fallible. We saw that with Enel, he had a hard counter in Luffy's rubber. We saw that with Luffy and Crocodile because he had to overcome the gap that Crocodile's Logia fruit, the Sand fruit, had with water. He had to find weaknesses. We saw that with Zoro versus Mr. One because he had to create new techniques and he had to master his styles to overcome slicing people who were made out of more durable materials. And we saw him bring that back as he was able to slice Pacifista. One Piece's simple power system is something that we were all very used to. That is, up until the 2-year time skip when Haki was introduced. Then, Devil Fruit users suddenly were knocked down a rung as the very simple power system opened up into this vast universe of different techniques. Well, not vast so much as an expansion on 3 techniques that offered many different varieties of moves. We suddenly saw people who, before the 2-year time skip, were threats become absolute fodder as people learned this new system. Haki became the end-all be-all. We see that with Doflamingo. We see that with Smoker getting dominated. We see that with Kaido, as he says as much. Kaido says Haki beats all devil fruits. If you can't master Haki, you can't master the new world. So where does Kid factor in all this? Well, I think that's fairly obvious. He only focused on his devil fruit and never gave us any reason to believe he had anything impressive to show as far as feats went. And I'll say magnetism is an immensely powerful and versatile power to have. We've seen it shown over numerous media, games, comics, anime, but no other medium portrays the power better for my needs than comics with the good old master of magnetism himself, Magneto. Marvel in that regard is quite useful for this purpose. Their particular brand of taking things to the next logical conclusion, at least for expanding power sets, has inspired many artists and writers to influence their worlds with similar characters and designs. Now, I'm not saying that Oda was inspired by manga or other comics. Whether or not he was doesn't really matter, and I don't really care. What does matter in this relation is that we as readers were inspired by other characters in media. We can't help as a community but to compare and power scale. Magnetism, at least as far as it's portrayed in other media, and Magneto is a great example of this, shows off so many diverse abilities that go well beyond mere ferromancy. Truly, Magneto has gone beyond magnetism and has entered the realm of rending planets asunder, creating magnetic fields capable of withstanding planetary demolition, terraforming tectonic plates to reform islands and create new ocean currents, and somehow generating blasts of energy from them. He's really got it all. And it's not just Magneto either. There's numerous examples of characters using the power with less to do more. We see Risotto in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Wind using ferromancy to manipulate the iron in blood to create honestly unrealistic metal objects like scissors and razors in people's bloodstreams to harm them from the inside. Misaka Mikoto, who I didn't even know about until I saw my dad watching Railgun, is an excellent example of using magnetism and ferromancy to create weaponry and enhance her own mobility through magnetic fields. There really are limitless options for magnetism as an ability shown throughout media, and the most that we've seen Kid U up until the time skip was making big limbs out of scrap metal. I've been told before that Kid is simply a case of poor writing or author bias, as whenever we see him compared to Luffy and Law, he's always given the short end of the stick. He got beat down by Kaido repeatedly, lost an arm to Shanks, or rather Ben Beckman, Shanks' subordinate. He got dominated in Sabaody, he was betrayed by other members of the worst generation, put into slavery, and then there's his most recent defeat against Shanks, which was especially egregious. But as you might notice, most of the stuff that's happening to him has been happening to Law and Luffy as well. Both of his rival captains have faced their fair share of betrayal and defeat before returning stronger and overcoming it. So what makes it laughable when Kid does it? Well, aside from Kid's blatant overconfidence, he lacks the same knowledge of his abilities that Luffy and Law have. Despite being portrayed in the same echelon as the two, Kid is notorious for a few reasons. The first being the most obvious, he simply just doesn't use Haki. It's a critical part of the world now, unfortunately, and Haki is the defining factor of this new world, as Kaido said before. It's made painfully clear that without Haki, you cannot survive at this tier of strength. Yet we saw that even without Haki, Kid was able to fight alongside Law and Luffy pretty much equally, and he even got the final hit on Big Mom. It's honestly kind of funny because we have confirmation that he has access to all three forms of Haki, but he either chooses not to use them and relies solely on his devil fruit, or, what is frankly the more disappointing theory, his Haki is simply more instinctual, like that of Usopp, Sanji, or Zoro. If his Haki is something that he just can't call on at will like the others, then it makes sense why he doesn't rely on it. And taking it further, it makes sense that he doesn't train it because he's had his devil fruit for far longer. His cocky and headstrong attitude doesn't let him stray away from his path, and we see him pay the price for that in spades. Let me say it bluntly. Kid is not an example of poor writing, or an author showing bias for other characters, or not utilizing or knowing how to use their character properly. To find a good example of that, we need only switch from One Piece to its contemporaries back during the Big Three era. Bleach and Naruto are chock full of prime examples of poor writing and underutilization of character potential. Tenten, a supposed kenjutsu master that is able to learn and master any weapon simply by wielding it once, is armed with a massively powerful sealing scroll by the end of the series, and yet she's announced to lack the chakra to properly use it, despite knowing at least 3 people who have immense amounts of chakra at their disposal at any given time at that point, and incredible chakra control to the point that one of them spread their nigh infinite chakra pool across the entire army during that same war. Yet the weapon, and Tenten by proxy, are never used or even seen after that point. Even before that, she lost relevance, despite being on the most feared Konoha Genin group at the time, after her first and damn near only fight in the series. Bleach, I would argue, is even worse in that regard. It has several characters to be given immense or downright confusing powers that would break the series altogether. A majority of Vizards don't have a single dub to their name despite their immense power, or any showings of being any use to allies despite being introduced as the next powerful faction next to the Arrancar and the Soul Society. Even worse than them, I'd say, is Chad. Simply put, there is not a single character more squandered in anything I've read or watched since. Now, maybe I haven't quite read enough yet, and I'm always reading new manga whenever I can, but Chad was heralded by this line from Ichigo. Unfortunately, by the end of the series, he really only has one fight where he's actually beaten somebody that mattered, and it's not against Gantenbein. Though I'm glad that he did get a win against Gant, the win ultimately does not matter one bit as he immediately jobs to Noitora. I'd love it. I'd have loved it if Kubo played more with the hollow themes of his arms, maybe giving him a full suit of armor or an advancement beyond the two arms. But we ultimately get nothing from Chad from start to finish. He's quite simply a moral support character and supplies nothing else. I truly wish I could be more charitable about it too, because he was one of my favorite characters in Bleach growing up. On the other hand, if you want examples of really great picks of characters who are insanely strong despite having no real idea as to how their powers work, you can look at Jujutsu Kaisen. Two characters stand out who have power and potential equal to, if not greater than, Satoru Gojo himself, despite their lack of full knowledge of their power. These two characters being none other than Yuji Itadori, the main character, and Fumihiko Takaba, both of which have an insanely high potential, wielding great cursed energy reserves and control. Yuji, though not having a cursed technique to his name, is able to contain Sukuna with next to no ill side effects, a feat that no other character is said to be able to do. Beyond that, he has strength, speed, and stamina that puts him on par with special grade curses. It's said by Megami that if the Tokyo team all ganged up on Yuji without cursed energy, Yuji would demolish them all. Despite his immense strength, his lack of a curse or true understanding cannot be understated. He's only just been thrust into a world that his peers have known their whole lives, so it stands to reason that he's just not got the skill to make it work. And Fumihiko, well, his power is just insane. Absolutely broken, and there's no two ways about it. The simplest way to define comedian is that anything Fumihiko finds funny or anything he thinks would be funny if it happened, happens. If he's losing a fight and he thinks it would be funny if he suddenly turned around and all of his injuries were gone, then they're gone. If he, theoretically, thinks it would be funny that he suddenly were to have an infinite amount of cursed energy, there's no reason to believe that he couldn't achieve that. Effectively, his powers are that of Toon Force, like Bugs Bunny and Popeye before him. He is exactly as strong as he thinks he is funny, and he thinks he's goddamn hilarious. But his understanding of his power is simple, and he doesn't just throw out constant blockbusters at every turn despite potentially being the strongest being in existence. I ask you, is this bad writing? Let me answer for you then, not at all. Yuji isn't afforded the time to develop a curse technique as he spends most of his time in the story dead trying to hold Sukuna back and hunting down increasingly stronger curses like Kenjaku and Mahito. As far as Fumihiko goes, his main limiting factor is that his powers are held back by his terrible slapstick comedy styling and the narrow lens he views the world through. If he were to, say, expand his view of comedy, perhaps he really could take the world by storm, but he stubbornly sticks to what he likes, and that's a deliberate character trait of his. Now let's finally address Kid's allegations. Is he stupid? Is he weak? Does he not have any survival instincts whatsoever? How fraudulent is Captain Eustass Kid really? Well, I'd say he's not at all. Let me introduce the many elephants in the room. Number 1, Kid doesn't use Haki in a world where Haki is required. Number 2, Kid's abilities are heavily reliant on his creativity, and he's apparently lacking in that department when we're introduced to him. Number 3, Kid's pride clouds his judgment and prevents him from running from a fight. Number 4, Kid's 2 encounters with Shanks are a clever, quote, double wank. I've already touched on Kid's choice of not using Haki earlier, so I'm not going to waste time on it now. I will, however, speak about Kid's lacking creativity, a problem that he has somewhat mitigated recently with two things. The first being damned punk and what his making that on the fly truly means, and two is his Devil Fruit's awakening. When we are reintroduced to Kid post-time skip, we see him with a metal arm. It's been safe to assume that he's just been manipulating it this entire time, but more recently we've seen that he's able to create incredibly complex machinery and artillery. Before anyone says that he's been shown making machinery before, I'm talking about the damned punk, more specifically, a literal railgun with the power to put Big Mom in the dirt. Even with help from Law, this is an absolutely massive power-up for him. This also means that because of his ability to create advanced machinery on the fly, that he probably designed his own arm and it functions autonomously without his Devil Fruit. Granted, we don't know one way or the other, but still both options for his arm are very involved. He either is always controlling it, articulating fine movements unconsciously with his Devil Fruit alone, or he has created a working cybernetic arm for himself. I'd forgotten before, they actually did show that Kid with Seastone on had to have his arm removed, which means that he has been articulating it with his Devil Fruit. However, this doesn't detract from the fact that he is doing precise movements with it, nor does it detract from the potential that he can, with his increased knowledge of what his Devil Fruit can do, that he can make an autonomous cybernetic arm, that he does not need his Devil Fruit to use anymore. He's clearly not lacking in creativity from where we saw him 2 years ago, and that's a very good thing. Then there's the matter of his awakening. The ability to put magnetic poles onto non-metallic objects is incredibly important. It offers a ton of utility and creative outlet, but he's only just gotten it. There hasn't been enough time for him to develop any flashy techniques with it outside of just trapping Big Mom between some heavy objects, and it's unfair to judge him as the only other awakening we've seen at the time is a person who has had his ability for much longer, and Luffy, who literally has the strongest Devil Fruit in existence. Unfortunately, moving into the next point, Kid is terribly cocky and indescribably prideful. He's not stupid, but he perhaps is just a little bit dumb as well. He's devoted his time to mastering his Devil Fruit, figuring out the ins and outs of how best to utilize its facets, but in that same way, he's kind of failing himself. Now, I'm not about to stand up on my soapbox and lie to you, say that Luffy is smart, but we all know he's a bit of a prodigy when it comes to fighting. Law, on the other hand, is definitely a genius. He's a doctor, but he's also spent a good amount of time learning his Devil Fruit, being a doctor, and mastering Haki at the same time. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's not so much that Haki is the problem, but Kid is rigid. He's specializing his abilities in one singular regard, and he is good at it, don't get me wrong, but the problem is that he needs to diversify his assets, so to speak. In a world where the power system has evolved and optimized to the point where if you are lacking this one special fundamental thing, you are not able to break the power ceiling, and everybody is repeating that point ad nauseum, Kid refuses to strengthen his Haki. Yet despite all of this, or perhaps in spite of all of this, Kid is worth 3 billion, and he did help defeat Big Mom, and he did deal enough damage to Kaido to earn some level of respect, who is potentially the most durable person we will ever see in One Piece. Kid did all of that, despite lacking the one fundamental thing that overrides all else: Haki. Without Haki, Kid has become a powerful threat. And that leads us to the final elephant in the room. Shanks obliterated Kid. Like, without hesitation, without mercy. Or did he? Let's take a bit of a closer look at those panels. You see, as Kid approaches Elbaf, he's made vaguely aware that Shanks should be in the area by Killer, and the assortment of his fleet loitering around. He has bad blood with Red-Haired and wants to get his get back. And I can respect that, especially since he just came out of defeating another Yonko and was still recovering. Nevertheless, he ignores Shanks' warning and attempts to strike with his newfound power, the damned punk, a firearm we previously saw overpowering Big Mom. There are panels that also suggest that, originally, Shanks' warning was just a bluff. We see him go from saying, "I'm going to beat Kid and take his poneglyph if he doesn't get out of here," to completely ignoring his threats and talking with his other crew members, disregarding Kid as a non-factor entirely. It isn't until Shanks has a vision with his observation Haki that tells him that Kid is charging up something that he cannot recover from by way of losing too much of his fleet before he even has a chance to set out. Shanks has a brief moment where he panics and has to step into action. A man who wasn't worth his time or attention before the time skip, who Ben Beckman took care of easily, has suddenly become enough of a threat that the captain himself needs to interfere. And interfere he does, blitzing Kid and his entire crew after calling a scramble order on his own. Shanks in this one instant obliterates Captain Eustass Kid because he, ignoring caution and safety, without a lick of Haki, and while only using his devil fruit, poses enough of a threat on his own that he alone would have impeded Shanks and stopped his plans for departure. Oda uses this one moment as a benchmark for Shanks, while simultaneously showing just how strong Kid is for having gotten this far with his lacking repertoire. There is so much left for Kid to do in One Piece. But ultimately, if Oda decides that he's run his course, this is a fine place for him to be defeated, all to prove a point. At least, it is for me. But I would love to see Kid return once again from the brink, even stronger than the last time. Kid's greatest strength, after all, is his enduring will, his tenacity. Not to mention, there's so many new places that the Jiki-Jiki fruit can go now, that he's expanded his arsenal to high tech and awakened his power. Being able to pull and push people around a battlefield, creating revolutionary weaponry mid-fight, magnetic force fields and projections. Hell, with his ship the Victoria Punk destroyed, I'd love to see him come back either with a full metal ship that he controls, or one that he's designed to be fully automated with his devil fruit. There's definitely many places and all sorts of new heights that Captain Kid could reach if and when he returns to the story. I think his hubris has made him the perfect candidate to showcase just how strong Shanks really is for us, though it has led to a lot of people discrediting how strong Kid really is. Nevertheless, I await his return to the story and hope to see a blazing comeback. On the other hand, the slander is incredibly hilarious, and I hope the jokes continue flying regardless.